everyone, and thanks for joining our webinar today, How Webinars Move Customers Through the Sales Cycle. On behalf of Adobe and American Marketing Association, we welcome you. And now I'd like to go ahead and introduce our moderator for today, Anthony Salas, Online Events Manager with the American Marketing Association. Anthony, over to you.
Great. Thanks so much, Alna. Appreciate it. And hello, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today. And I'm excited to introduce our speaker for today. He's a good friend of ours, and we've worked with him on many occasions. Excited to introduce Mike Agron. And Mike is a webinar demand generation expert and author, as well as the co-founder and executive webinar producer for WebAttract. And WebAttract is a professional service and training organization that helps B2B sales and marketing professionals associated with global and emerging brands, as well as media publishers, excel at using webinars across the entire life cycle. He and his team are passionate about helping their clients meet and exceed their commercial outcomes while delighting their audiences. And again, we're excited to have Mike with us today. We know he's got a lot of really great, interesting information he's going to be sharing. So with that, from Sacramento, California, I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Mike.
Thank you, Anthony, and welcome everybody to today's webinar. I am very excited about the topic. It's something that's near and dear to any of us who are using webinars for demand gen, which is how do you use webinars to move customers through the sales cycle. That's me on the left, and that's my license plate on the right. So if you're in California, Northern California, and you see me, honk. But I have it because I'm, as Anthony said, we're absolutely passionate about webinars, and that's pretty much what I do when I'm not riding my bike is eat, live, and breathe webinars. So today is really for demand gen professionals and other webinar professionals who are using webinars. And there's three things that I want to make sure we cover today. The first is how do webinars help attendees move through the buying cycle? And then in doing that, what are some of the strategies and best practices to make sure that you have predictable outcomes? And as Anthony said, that meet or exceed your commercial goals as well as delight your audience. And then we'll talk about some critical KPIs to track before, during, and after the webinar. So the real question is, did the webinar move attendees' intent to purchase? That's really what it's all about if we're doing a webinar for demand gen. And there's 6 ways I've come up with measuring how webinars influence the sales cycle. I'm going to give examples in just a moment in the case studies of most of these. The first, obviously, is how many net new deals were you able to close. But another important way they move attendees to the sales cycle is being able to convert prospects into customers. And I'll show you that too. Another good use case for webinars and measuring their success is were you able to your existing base upsell and cross-sell? And how were you able to increase the sales pipeline? And then remembering that using webinars can also help you take your thought leadership and put you on the map as a viable player. Give some examples of that, and the ability to reach new markets and geographies. This is something that webinars can do like nothing else because of the ability to cut across time zones. So I want to also mention there's some complimentary content that I highly recommend. The first is a fabulous study that the Content Marketing Institute and Adobe Connect put out. It's a research report called Webinars. They're not just for leads anymore. And I'm not sure if we have that available for you today to download, but absolutely you want to get that. And also, I'll give you some information at the end, is a book we wrote called Webinar Ready. And it's a step-by-step guide to hosting successful webinars. And I'll give you an opportunity to opt in for that. And it's really our playbook. So everything you're going to hear today is covered in one form or another in that book. So what I want to be able to do is set the stage to how you set the stage to optimize outcomes. That's going to be the first thing. And then I'm going to go into 5 case studies, and I'm going to share best practices and metrics. Then I'll give you some tips for pulling it all together. And I want to give you some time at the end to ask your questions. I'm more excited to have your questions, and so I'm going to fly by these as best I can, and hopefully it provokes a lot of questions. And all of these are actual clients of ours or were clients of ours. They're real case studies. I don't believe in theory or academic ideas, so everything you're going to hear is something that actually worked. But before we get into that and set the stage, I want to hear from you, and I want to understand a little bit about your use cases. So I'm going to move this poll up here, and if you could just take a moment and tell me, how do you use webinars today? Are they mostly sales and product demos? Do you use them for customer or partner training? Do you do demand gen webinars already? Are you just investigating webinars, or you just don't do webinars? Go ahead and take a moment. I'd love to see how everybody weighs in on this, and then I'll be able to have an idea of where I want to focus on my presentation. But everybody who's voted has, so I'm going to go ahead and broadcast the results. So if you take a look at that, it looks like almost half of us are using them for sales and product demos. And a good percentage, about a third, is for customer partner training. And again, about another half are using them for demand gen. And about 20%, 21% are investigating, and a small handful aren't using webinars. So hopefully we are able to give you some motivation to see how successful these can be to help you achieve your sales goals. If we take a look at setting the stage, and everything that we do in webinars is based on the fact that webinars are theatrical. They help breathe life into ordinary static content. And so we use a lot of these metaphors. And in doing that, one of the things to consider in doing a webinar is, what are you trying to achieve? Which of these three outcomes is it? Is it trying to raise brand awareness? Is it promoting your thought leadership? Is it driving sales? Or is it a combination of all of these? And often it is, because your challenge is really to create an engaging event that's going to attract people, that's going to corral and spur them, so they'll want to have a conversation with you after the webinar to become your customer. And I can tell you from my 30 years experience in sales, nothing happens until you have a conversation with someone. And more importantly, when they're interested to have a conversation with you, that's when the real sales process begins. And so in doing that, in being able to create and generate leads and develop webinars that engage your audience, there's three parts of the life cycle that you have to do if you want to be able to convert prospects into advocates and customers. The first is attracting that audience. The second is, once they are signed in and logged into the webinars, to make sure they're engaged, so they're inspired to want to have a conversation with you afterwards. And I'm setting the stage here because every one of these case studies you're going to see has followed the best practices around that. And probably the biggest thing that we know today is that today's B2B buyer's journey is done online. 70% of today's buyers want to do their research online before they speak with someone. And this often reminds me of the fact that it's a lot different than it used to be. However, realizing that they're looking for information, that the webinar can be an ideal time to provide them information that they can't get from a white paper or research report. And what I have to always remind myself in doing webinars and our clients is that some people are just doing research. And so if you take a look at the graphic on the right of the retail store, that always reminds me, and I'm sure all of us have had the experience, we go into a retail store, we're not exactly sure what it is we want, but we're just curious. And then all of a sudden, out of nowhere, some overenthusiastic sales clerk jumps up in front of us and says, "Hi, may I help you?" And our natural response is, "No, thanks, I'm just looking." And I think that's a way you have to realize that a lot of people attending webinars are. They're not all ready to buy it right now. And that 70% number continues to grow. One of the ways, though, in when I set up these case studies, to be able to attract the interest of people attending your webinars is to keep them away from being a sales pitch and being informational. And that's what content marketing is about. It needs to be based on business outcomes, a case study, best practices, lessons learned, metrics, return on investment, not being product-centric, not talking about features and benefits or pricing. And you're going to see from each of these case studies that's the case. None of the discussions were around the product. They were all around educating people, because a good webinar helps make buyers more intelligent, and that way, if they're interested, you have a more profitable opportunity and an ability to interact with them after the webinar. But they're also ripe for attracting prospects who want to become your customers. They're very powerful magnets. And what we have found is people are in one of two states. They're either like the gentleman on the left, who's got a lot of questions, a lot of pain points. He knows he can get better outcomes, but he's not sure how. Or, as the lady on the right, she's actively looking for a solution. So people who are in either one of these situations here are the people that are going to want to attend your webinar. And I want to just go back to this for a second and say it begs that the topic must be a must-have, not a nice-to-have. Nobody has time today to attend something that isn't really going to help them with this. But another opportunity is really understanding how disruption can be so powerful in your messaging. And my simple formula is this: opportunity is directly proportional to confusion and change. Think about it for a second. When people are confused and there's a lot of change going on, they're looking for answers, they're looking for help, they're looking for ideas. This is a perfect way to provide it. And the reason is because disruptive markets and industry shifts that are happening all the time, they allow you to tell a story beyond sound bites. They allow you to add a narrative to whatever the topic is, something, again, that's very difficult to do in just a white paper or research report. But they allow you to be able to highlight the innovative solutions that you have and the benefits they bring. And it's also a fantastic opportunity to promote your thought leadership. And thought leadership is extremely important today. In fact, I have a very good friend and a colleague. His name is Mitchell Levy. He actually has a thought leadership group on LinkedIn called Thought Leadership Best Practices. It's a very, very interesting group. And his definition of thought leadership is when others recognize you as the expert in your space and seek out your help, you become the go-to person. And that's such an important position to have. When people trust your expertise, they want to come to you and they want to get your help. And the reason that's so important in webinars is that thought leadership allows you to take advantage of three popular themes. And again, these case studies you hear are based on them. The first is actually a case study where you're talking about business improvement. And if you notice in this webinar here, this was a case study of how Parker Aerospace took advantage of existing workstations to do more simulation, and it was presented by HP and Intel. And they showed the audience what the benefits were of this. The second is a how-to or a tutorial. And in this case, it was to get to engineers who are primarily designing equipment and construction projects with legacy materials, and to get them to look that there's a business case for composites. That composites, while everyone is familiar, work in aerospace and aviation, there's ways of going beyond that. So this was a tutorial of why you can do that. And probably one of the most powerful ways to promote thought leadership is when I said industry shifts, particularly changes in standards and compliances. This was one done with Underwriters Laboratory a few years ago that discussed the standards of impacting electric vehicle infrastructure equipment. This was something where all the confusion and change meant that manufacturers really needed to understand how these impact them. And as far as finding great content, it's all over. There's no shortage. Could be white papers, could be from industry analysts, case studies, clients, partners, publishers, editors, authors. It's all over the place. But the most important thing is you in the audience. Everything we do must be for you, because if we're not able to get you and solve your problems, there's no opportunity to have a conversation after the webinar. Now, I want to take a moment and talk about the 6 key webinar KPIs. And this is something that we use before, during, and after the webinar. And each one of them is a webinar in itself. I'm going to take a moment and walk you through the gold standard, which is the click-through ratio. But the other ones are, what type of attendance ratio do you have? How many people who registered actually attended? What type of engagement did you have with online polls, and how did people weigh in? And from exit surveys, what type of quantitative and qualitative information did you get back? How long were you able to retain your audience? We like to see at least 80% of the peak audience on at the start of Q&A. And what type of on-demand viewings did you have? I'll give you more information on this as we go on. But when I say the click-through ratio is the gold standard, if there's anything you take away about KPIs, it's this. And it's a real simple measurement. And what it measures is the percent of people who come to your landing page and register. And so the people that click on the landing page and then actually register can tell you everything you need to know about what kind of registration you're going to have, what kind of attendance, is your registration landing page working, and how well does your message align with your value proposition. And to put some numbers around it, if you have less than 20%, there's a problem. Something is not connecting. And so what I mean by that is if 100 people come to your landing page and less than 20 of them sign up, there's probably some tweaking that needs to be done. It could be a subject line, it could be a title, it could be the credibility or not having the credibility of third-party speakers. There's a lot of different things. If you're at about 25% plus or minus, you're doing fine. If you get above 35%, you're really cooking. And you will see, as I give you some of these examples, how there's a correlation between the registration, the click-through ratio, and the attendance. So let's get into the 5 case studies. The first is a company that I'm sure everybody knows as a global brand is Bosch. This is for Bosch Healthcare. And their interest was to be able to attract and educate a diverse group of health-based decision makers. And they wanted to drive new product sales, but they knew that they had to give them something around their thought leadership to show them why they'd want to be interested in telehealth. And so what they did is they came up with a whole process and approval method for getting reimbursed for using telehealth. And if you think about it, if you're a healthcare organization or accountable care organization, you need to be able to bill and invoice for services. And this showed them how they could do it. So this first case study is going to show how they used their thought leadership to build a sales pipeline. And the way they did it was coming up with the first topic, which was it was called Advancing Remote Patient Monitoring Through New Coding Options. And it absolutely embraced the industry disruption. Think about all the industries. What industry other than health has gone through, or like health, has gone through so many changes? I mean, from the Affordable Care Act, Obamacare, whatever you want to call it, there's so much confusion going on. So this was an opportunity for Bosch to embrace industry disruption. And they educated this diverse audience of decision makers and physicians by giving them a roadmap on how they could use telehealth services and how they could use these coding options. And then there was an industry expert who discussed how these codes could further impact the medical loss ratio. And the results from that were 630 people registered. The click-through ratio was 53%, very, very high. The attendance was one of the highest I've ever seen, 64% or 402. Again, a direct correlation between the click-through ratio and the attendees. High degree of attendee satisfaction. It increased their sales pipeline, and it definitely helped put them on the map with their thought leadership. It made them a viable player. And one of the things that was so successful and exciting about it is that this leadership series that started out with one now has become a cornerstone of their modern content marketing. And we're actually delivering the 7th webinar next week on a topic along telehealth, but using mobile. So it's continued to pick up and build pipeline. It's continued to pick up a following. The next case study is another company that's well known, perhaps not as well known as Bosch, but they're called Dex One. And Dex One used to be the R.H. Donnelly company, and they were known for printing the yellow pages. Well, talk about an industry disruption and shifts. All of a sudden, this organization finds themselves having to reinvent themselves to their clients, which are small, medium businesses, and show them that they could be a digital player or a player in the digital marketing world. They had to completely transform their offerings, and what their goal was to get the existing base excited and attract new customers. So the way this was done was using tutorials, and each of the webinars, and I think there were a total of 15 done in a couple years, featured an expert. Here's an example of a consultant. His name is Barry Maltz, and he's an expert on small business. And he came and spoke to this audience who was very, very concerned what to do, how to keep their sales growing. And so the title of the webinar was Sales Unstuck, How to Get Your Sales Growing Fast. And he gave a really excellent tutorial on selling strategies. He told them how to break what he calls the double helix trap, which is how you have to get yourself from being unstuck in not selling but just doing delivery, how you have to do both. And he gave a lot of free tips. He wasn't afraid to give away information, nor was Dex. Gave them a sample email letter on how to get back in with some of their former clients. And he talked about the importance of managing social media and gave them a clear call to action. Now notice, none of this had anything directly to do with Dex, but here's where it all tied in. If we look here, we had such an interest in this webinar that over 2,000 people registered. Again, look at the click-through ratio, 42%, 40% attending. The average duration was 54 minutes, high degree of attendee satisfaction, but it created 171 meetings on the spot. That was one of the nice things that came from it, because at the end of the webinar, we asked the audience if they wanted additional information, and 171 people opted in. But what was really cool about that was that those 171 who had conversations opened the opportunity to then talk about Dex One social media reputation management program. So what Barry did when he talked about social media kind of greased the skids for the audience to be open and receptive to learning about this. Now I'm going to go to the third case study, and this is a company called Contactual, and they're a virtual contact center. And what they wanted to do was to demonstrate using real-world issues that business leaders are grappling with today to show them the business value of a cloud-based on-demand contact center technology. And they also wanted to go beyond just the IT audience, because as important as IT is, there are other people in the group that needed to get information. So the opportunity here and the business value here was, how do we move customers or attendees to the sales cycle? And this is going to show how we were able to convert prospects into customers. And so the name of the webinar was Soar to New Customer Service Heights with Virtual Call Center Technology. It was a client-led case study, not given by Contactual. It was by a company called TradeCard. And what this person did is he absolutely spoke to the pain points of everybody in the audience. And he shared his lessons learned, best practices, and what were the business outcomes. And he talked about how using Contactual gave him the opportunity to flexibly deploy the solution. The reliability was excellent. And rather than make IT the GOAT, if you will, for why things weren't getting done, he showed them how in his organization, IT was able to be freed and work on other projects. So he made a champion and a friend out of IT. The other thing that he did was he validated the out-of-the-box integration into other CRM solutions from them. But here's the best part, no selling. Contactual didn't have to sell at all. It was this individual's passion and excitement and results that got the audience interested. So what happened? Well, 151 people registered, and this was a smaller but more targeted audience. And again, a very respectable click-through ratio of 42%, high degree of interest in attendance, 46%, pulled in people from 11 countries. But here's what was really cool. It took an attendee to become a buyer in less than 2 weeks, and it also moved 4 attendees up in the funnel. And the way that worked was because the actual customer spoke about business value, there was a prospect and an attendee in the audience who was on the fence that right after the webinar called her rep, asked for a demo, and that resulted in less than 2 weeks in them signing a recurring annual service agreement. So we just covered with Bosch how you could use thought leadership to increase your sales pipeline, and here we talked about with Contactual how you're able to convert prospects into customers, and then of course with Dex how you could upsell within your own base. This is an interesting case study too. This is a company called Mercer International. Now Mercer International is a regional company in New Jersey, and they had not been heard from many people, but what their goal was to attract and educate environmental compliance decision makers. They wanted to show them innovative ways to remove oil and solids from water in industrial processing plants to drive new sales. So this is how they closed the deal with this. And what they did is they came up with a topic called separating the contenders from the pretenders in the world of oil-water separation. Talk about a niche topic. And it was fascinating because they brought on an industry expert who talked about, again, going beyond the status quo, talking about disruption in industry shifts, and showed the trends and opportunities from that. And he did a case study on the total cost of ownership of oil and water separation. And he showed the audience some best practices on how they could be compliant to avoid fines and citations, and delivered on the invitation promises. That's also an important thing. If we're going to move customers through the sales cycle, we've got to deliver on what we promise is in the invitation, and what's in the invitation has to address either their pain points or how they're going to get better outcomes. So let's talk about what happened. Had a nice group of 146 people register, had a high attendance rate, good satisfaction, a lot of post-sale and nurturing, but here's the best part. Unbeknownst to them, there was an attendee in the audience that saw their solution as something that they could use. They were invited to bid, and they became the successful bidder to provide this information or to provide the solution in the first U.S. nuclear facility to be built in over 3 decades, and it was over a 7-figure sale, over $1 million sale. And I remember I got something sent to me from them. The guy did a video testimony. He was so excited about that. Plus, they got other deals in the pipeline. So we just talked about 4 different examples. I'm going to go to my 5th example right now and give you some insight on how you can measure how attendees move through the toll gates to become buyers. This is a publisher called Inside GNSS, and they focus on engineers in the global navigation satellite system community. And what they have done is they use real well-known thought leaders to educate audiences on very, very technical and timely topics. And that moves the purchasing needle for its sponsors, and I'm going to show you how. So they're the sponsor. They find sponsors, large companies such as Trimble, Spirent, and they, through working with us, produce these webinars, but their whole objective is to help them attract the audience and get people who want to get into a conversation. And so the topics are, as I said, very technical. In the upper left-hand corner, it's hybrid positioning and technologies for mobile users, challenges in GNSS inertial integration. And then one of the most enjoyable ones was on unmanned systems or drones. And these were all bringing experts in, people from government, people from academia who could really share information that you couldn't get any other way. So part of the secret in doing these webinars and their tutorials is you could not get this information any other way than by attending the webinars. So here's some of the outcomes. 15 of these have been done in the last 3 years. An average of 8,340 have registered. Average click-through ratio has been 48%. Again, a very high number. 46% have attended. Actually, that number is even higher when you discount the fact that over 60 countries register, and most of the attendees come from the North American time zone. So that's probably closer to 50%. Another metric and another way of measuring the outcomes is on the on-demand viewings. There's been about 1,900 on-demand viewings, and 401 of them, at least, have been from fresh new, are considered fresh new leads. So in addition to doing the webinar, they leverage the content, and that's why I love to call it the content marketing gift that keeps giving, to get more leads. Their average time in session was 80 minutes of a 90-minute webinar. Now think about that. Most webinars are 60 minutes, and when they came to us and they said they want to do a 90-minute webinar, I was scratching my head and I said, how are you going to keep people that long? And you'll see in just a moment, or you'll see with people spending 80 minutes, they can't get enough of this. Their average satisfaction was 94%. But here is the real, where the rubber hits the road. At the end of the webinar, after the audience has been educated and given a lot of information, in a post-webinar survey, when they log off, it comes up in their browser. One of the questions is, having attended today's webinar, your plans to purchase or acquire products or services, how has it impacted you? And if you look at this, 47% said it increased. 24% said they were just researching, but now they intend to acquire. That's 71%. And that's identified by the individual who's interested in having a conversation. 24% said they were just researching and see no need. Only 5% said their interest decreased. This is really what it's all about in being able to move the needle. And they can do it because they're not selling, they're giving great information, but it's at the very end of the webinar when they've given a lot of great information that they ask this question. So what are some of the best practices and lessons learned from this case study? Number one, using real thought leaders and subject matter experts to keep decision makers in the know is very appealing. The content is a must-have. It's not a nice-to-have. This is stuff that these engineers are clamoring to get information on. It helps them in their projects. And also, the conversations you would think, because they were highly technical, could be dry, anything but. The conversations are kept fluid, they're on track, they're engaging, and that's partially using a moderator for the webinar that's familiar with the topic. And to make sure that it wasn't just a one-way experience, these are designed with 2 Ask the Expert sessions. So after the first 45 minutes, we would do an Ask the Expert session, and then towards the end, we would do another one. And after the webinar, the sponsors are given a complete set of analytics and all of these KPIs that they can mine, and they can start to segment and identify who's sales ready, who's not, who needs more nurturing. And because they had a clear call to action, they were able to get into it. So here's 5 examples of how we've moved people through the sales process. But before I start to take some questions, I want to remind everybody that in order to get these kind of results, you have to be willing to acknowledge that there's a lot of myths around webinars. And these are 3 of the biggest webinar myths that need to be debunked. And in fact, Anthony, I think we could do a webinar just on these. The first, a lot of people have the notion, just build it and they will come. And nothing could be further from the truth. Another one is, hey, I'm a great presenter. I'll just show up and wing it. That won't work. All of these require what we call table reads and dress rehearsals to make sure that they're on target with their messaging, that it aligns with the deliverables in the invitation, that they're crisp, and that they're mic'd properly. There's a lot of behind-the-scenes work. Again, goes back to a production. And the biggest myth is all attendees are sales ready to buy now. Not the case. They're in various parts of the sales cycle. So if we look at what we just covered on how webinars move customers through the sales cycle, there are 6 ways to measure your webinar effectiveness. Obviously, closing new deals is kind of a no-brainer. There's not much you have to say. You close new deals, it's a home run. But there's these other 4 or 5 ways that add value. Being able to help a prospect or an attendee become a customer by educating them or seeing something that's going to help them is very, very powerful. Same with being able to upsell and cross-sell to the existing base. I mentioned that study that Content Marketing Institute and Adobe did, and one of the things I loved about it is the title says webinars that are not just for leads anymore. And while Demand Gen is still a powerful way of using webinars, it's a wonderful way for retention and audience loyalty to use a webinar, and a great way to show your thought leadership and how you can help them in upsell and cross-sell. Increasing sales pipeline. Gave examples with Bosch. With everybody on here increased their sales pipeline. There isn't anybody on here who didn't do that. And using thought leadership, again, can put you on the map as a viable player. And not only if you're a well-known company, even though Bosch is a well-known company, they weren't as well-known in that space, but it puts them as a competitive differentiator by what they can do. People want to follow them. And the other thing is helps you reach new markets and geographies, particularly if you're underserved. In the example of the Inside GNSS, even though 60 countries registered and they all couldn't attend, there was a big uptake after the webinar for them to view the on-demand recording, as well as being able to follow up with them. So here's my 6 ways that you can use webinars to help customers move through the sales cycle. So my call to action to get started, to get results, are as follows. When you are planning your next webinar, what I'd like you to think of is, what are some of the market trends, industry shifts, and disruptions and challenges that you have the ability to educate an audience on? How can you bring your thought leadership to that? And then, because webinars are a very collaborative, iterative process, it really shouldn't be done in a vacuum. Use the opportunity to brainstorm with your colleagues, brainstorm with the speakers. Come up with topics that are must-have, that somebody really wants to attend. And make sure that the content has got a great opportunity to tell a story around it. This is where breathing life, where webinars allow you to breathe life into ordinary static content. You can build a narrative. You can go beyond sound bites and tell something that's engaging. And I don't think there's anything more important than having really knowledgeable speakers who bring their passion. In the example of Contactual, the gentleman from TradeCart believed with his heart and soul the results that he got, and that came across to the audience. And that's true for every one of these that we showed you here. The audience will know if you're genuine and you're connecting with them. And then as you're planning your webinars, always use KPIs, and those 6 metrics that I gave are excellent ones to use. And I'll give you some sources to get more information on it. I cover it in the book, and there's also, I have a presentation on SlideShare that goes into it more in more depth. But across the webinar lifecycle, if you're looking at the attract, engage, and convert, being able to measure what happens before the webinar, during the webinar, and after helps you measure your outcomes and your results. And without a doubt, you need a project plan. And as I'm often fond of saying, if you fail to plan, you plan to fail. There is nothing about doing a webinar that's easy. There's a lot of things that have to be juggled, and planning is probably the most important part of it, because something, if it isn't planned, it's going to slip through the cracks and you're going to have less than optimal results. But I guarantee you, if you follow all of these, you'll be able to come up with topics and webinars that will help you move your customers through the toll gates and move them up the sales process. Anthony, with that, I think I'm ready to go into taking some questions.
I'm glad you are, Mike, because we got some questions for you. I think you are hitting the nail on the head for a lot of individuals today. There's good questions coming in. So, Mike, again, great information here. I love the fact that you really hit on thought leadership. I think that's a term that often we forget about. I think, the whole sales pitch on a webcast can get really scary, and leadership is really, to me, the way to go. So one of the questions that we had come in here, this one's from Michael, along the lines of thought leadership is tied into subject matter experts. Any thoughts on how you can attract those individuals to be a part of your webcast?
Yes, there's several different ways. Thanks, Michael. I think that, in the examples of each of these case studies, there were a lot of external speakers used. and not all of them necessarily had a fee to speak. Somebody who completes a successful project, like the example with trade card and contactual, they're excited. They want to share their enthusiasm and their results with their peers. So they recognize not only are they helping out their provider, but they're also in a position to promote their own personal brand. So if you look at clients who have had successful implementations, or you look at partners, they're wonderful people to invite to participate in a webinar. Same with authors. It's a great chance for them to promote their thought leadership and, of course, indirectly speak about some of their books. So, I mean, those are some ways. There's also industry analysts, and I love working with publishers and editors of niche magazines, because they are the trusted advisor to their audience, and they can often bring a lot of interesting information to a webinar.
Excellent. Thanks so much, Mike. Appreciate that. I'm going to kind of back up as you started here. You know, you're talking about kind of the before, during, and after of the whole webinar process here. So starting with the before, we have a question from Stacy here, kind of lines up with that. And so she's wondering, you know, when you're starting that whole process, even getting your invite list together, who you're going to send out these emails or promotions to, how do you get those lists together? What's the best way for someone to determine, you know, who those need to go to? And what are your thoughts on maybe working with any kind of third-party partners, you know, doing any kind of database lists or things of that sort?
Okay, Stacy, thanks. Let me take each of those and answer the best I can. And Anthony, keep me on track if I miss one of them. But the first thing that, Stacy, you want to do is, are you looking to go beyond your house list? And if so, what is the value proposition that you're going to be presenting that will allow you to create an audience profile that matches it? In other words, you only want to invite people that are going to find value in what you're doing. So in the case of the Inside GNS, the sponsors want to get to engineering decision makers. So depending on what it is, identify what are the job functions and what are the titles, what are the levels of responsibility you want them to have, what industries are you interested in going after, what geographies, and also what revenue thresholds. If your sweet spot is selling to companies that are doing between 10 and 50 million a year, then focus on those size of companies. So I think the most important thing is, and that's where I said it's iterative, what is the topic? Is it a must-have? Is there a value proposition in there that's going to attract an audience? And then define who that audience is by profiling them with the industries, job titles, functions, geographies, revenue, so on and so forth. And then you can start to put together an idea of who you want to go after. Then who do you work with? How do you get that information? There's a lot of reputable sources. There's a lot of unreputable sources. You got to really be careful out there. And if you're dealing with someone that has lists, there's a lot of great list brokers out there. Find out their track record. Find out who they've done work for. And you can often find people out there that will have the demographic you want. If it's too wide, if what they offer you is more of a generic list, I'd be careful of it. There's a lot of factors you have to take into account, such as how deliverable is the list, so on and so forth. Publishers are also a great way to work because they have, by the fact that they have a publication, they're the trusted advisor, they have the audience. I mean, those are some of the ways to go. You can call us. I mean, we do a lot of work ourselves in that. But there's probably nothing more important than coming up with the right list and the right demographic, because if you can't attract the audience, nobody's going to show. That is the most important thing.
Yep, I think you hit them all, Mike. I think those are great points. Targeting is essential. I think another possible avenue too is working with your speaker, who
yes.
also may want to do some promoting on their own.
Yes.
Obviously, they've got a built-in audience, and they may want those people to attend and encourage others as well. So I think that's another one maybe to throw in there as well.
Yeah, if I can just tag on that real quickly. The question then is probably, okay, so you do all that, how many people can I expect to attract? And I'm going to give you just a real rough back of the envelope calculation. And we have found that if you have a database that matches your value proposition of about 50,000 names, okay, and you execute an email campaign 3 weeks before you go live, and you do 3 or 4 blasts or drips or touch points along the way, and you follow good email marketing practices, you should be able to attract between 1/4 to 1/2 of 1%. Translated, that's 125 to 250 people. Again, it can be higher, it can be lower, but the click-through ratio metric that I gave is really why I call that the gold standard. It'll tell you how well you're connecting. And that's probably a good rule of thumb, if you will, to follow on what kind of an audience you're going to get.
Great suggestion. Thanks, Mike. Good question here from Natalie. Talking about, the webcast has occurred, and now you're kind of into that after stage. Any thoughts or suggestions that you can share in regards to follow-ups? She's talking here about individuals who attended, maybe those who registered but couldn't make it. Would you suggest kind of sending out the same type of messaging to those two groups, or would you kind of change it up, maybe try to attract the no-shows in some way to something else?
I find that people who register and aren't able to attend can be just as interested, but the real world intruded that day. And so absolutely, a best practice is within 24 to 48 hours after the webinar to send a thank you email to both the attendees and to the no-shows. And you can change them up a little bit, but it's a good opportunity to kind of reiterate what you covered and to give them an opportunity to view the recording on demand, as well as get additional information. Maybe they want a white paper. Maybe they want a PDF of the presentation. And that's something that's really important to do. And it helps a lot in keeping the conversation going. That's one way. The other way is to take your recording, and we like to edit them and airbrush them, any imperfections out, and we can use parts of that recording, take highlights of the webinar, sound bites out of it, and share that to people that we're prospecting or that we're nurturing to give them additional information. I think that, as I said earlier, that webinars really can be and should be the content marketing gift that keeps giving. It's a great way to nurture folks. So yes, you want to send it out to people that didn't attend as well as people that did attend. And thanks for attending. We hope you found today's webinar of value. We covered the following. For additional information, click here. Sorry you weren't able to join us. This is what we covered. For additional information, give them the same thing. Give them an easy way to follow up with you.
Great point. Thank you. And another question here from Felicia, talking about KPIs, as you were giving some examples on that. I think a lot of them were to the actual performance of the webcast, the before and after results of that. So her question is, how do you convince or encourage your leadership team to develop KPIs that aren't just sales-centric, that kind of take the whole process into consideration?
Well, the way I look at it is, I really learned this. It was really trial by fire, because when I started professionally doing webinar production about 7 years ago, none of these KPIs, as I described them, really existed. There were email marketing metrics, and those are very important. And so I looked at this and I said because I don't have a leadership team as much as I have clients, but the clients have a leadership team, and I said, okay, all right, we need to show you that we have your confidence to have a methodology that will bring you success. We need to be able to demonstrate our use of best practices. And I said, but there needs to be a third leg to the stool, and that has to be metrics, a way to measure it. And so the way I would approach the leadership team is to say, really what this whole webinar is about, that a webinar can help you move your prospects and your customers through the sales cycle. And yes, close deals, that's one way, but here's 5 other ways to do it. And by using these KPIs that we have, we can track our results and our progress of how many people became interested in to have a conversation with us, how many of them actually were able to go from sitting on the fence and becoming a customer. I think you have to be able to tell the whole story of how KPIs and analytics can help you know if you've been successful, because if you know, there's an old saying, you know, if you don't care where you're going, you're not lost. And KPIs are absolutely the roadmap to navigate before, during, and after. And another thing that you can show management is when you do this, you can get a profile and a level of interest of who's registering for your webinars from asking a simple question when they register. What would you like to learn from this webinar? That's enormously valuable to take that information and to include it with some of the quantitative information. That information can be used internally with marketing, with sales. It also can be used to coach your speaker. So I think there's a whole lot of justification for doing this, and I'd be more than happy if you want to you know, give me a call and talk about it and how you can present it to your leadership team and why they should do this. Otherwise, I think the expectations are that we're just going to do webinars to close sales, and that's going to happen, but more often than not, it's going to really move customers through the sales cycle.
And question from Jeffrey, wanting to see if you can kind of clarify just a little bit the difference between closing a deal and moving that prospect to becoming an actual customer.
Well, I think in the way I look at it, Jeffrey, is that, as I said during my opening remarks, that nothing happens in sales until you have somebody who's interested to have a conversation with you. Once somebody is interested, that's the best buying signal in the world, because they're really interested and they want to know how you can help them. And so if you can get them into a conversation and you really have something that will solve their issue, then you're able to move them through the process of understanding what their needs, what their expectations are, and how you can solve that. So you can go through the sales cycle and create a proposal and deliver a proposal and work on that as a way to create them from just being an attendee or a prospect into becoming your customer, who then you have an opportunity to nurture them to become more than a customer, to become your advocate. Anthony, was that the whole question, or did I leave something out? I have a feeling I may have left something out.
That was it. Nope, you
Okay.
got it there.
Okay.
You definitely got it. So just really quick, probably got time for one more question here. I want to go back to the whole topic of KPIs again, because we talked about those 6, in particular the click-through ratio. So are there any others that you can think of or want to share that might be helpful when trying to really optimize the outcomes of these webinars?
Well, yes. I think once you have the click-through ratio, you have a pretty good indicator of what your attendance ratio is going to be, and there's going to be a certain expectation. The higher the click-through ratio, the higher the attendance. I always want to measure the attendance ratio, because the attendance ratio says how interested your registrants really were in attending. The other one is what type of participation you get in polls. I like to see about 70% of the audience participating. That shows a level of engagement, and I'm very interested in how they weigh in. The other one is audience retention. Were we able to stimulate the audience and inspire them enough to at least stay on to the start of the questions and answers? And the reason that's important is often people, when it comes to Q&A, they got their value, or they may want to stick around for 1 or 2, but they realize, hey, I got a chance to return a call or check my emails. So dropping off isn't necessarily a bad thing. But if we can keep 80 to 85% of them on, that's another thing. The surveys. We always want to know, on a scale of 1 to 5, how did today's webinar meet your expectations? You should get at least 80% so that it met was above or exceeded. And you want more above and exceeded than just met. You're always going to have a few people in there that are going to say it barely met or it didn't meet. That's fine. And then the other one is measuring the uptake on on-demand recordings. That can tell you how influential your social media pursuits are, what kind of buzz came around the webinar. And when you do and measure on-demand recordings, you want to measure not only the people that registered and didn't attend, but the people that attended and wanted to see it again. That's another inflection point. But the most interesting one is how many fresh new sales leads. And I gave that example for the GNSS group, that there was a high degree of people that came that neither registered or attended but wanted to learn. So those are the 6. And again, check out my 6 key metrics on SlideShare or in my book, and it goes into more detail. Those are the ones that you really want to keep your eye on.
All right. Well, Mike, thank you so much. This has really been a lot of great information today. And on behalf of the audience, thanks so much for all the time that you put into getting all this together. And thanks for being with us today.
It's been a blast. Thank you, Anthony. Thank you, Alna. I look forward to the next time. And audience, thanks so much for joining, and have a great rest of the week.